Hello everyone, welcome back to Blockman editor tutorial. In these videos, we will give you a complete introduction to the Blockman editor. In this lesson we will continue to learn more about buff. Go to the editor and select buff in the game components view. Let's create a new buff first. Click the Performance Properties button in the Properties view on the right. Performance properties of buff have 4 functions, including sound effect, special effect, appearance, and enable transparency. Let's take a look at the sound effect first. The sound effect function enables a specified audio played when the entity triggers the buff. If you only want the entity currently triggering the buff to hear the sound effect, and do not want it synchronized to other entities, you can choose to check audible to self only. If we check loop, then when the entity triggers the buff, the specified audio will play in a loop until we remove the buff from the entity. Next is the special effect function. The special effect function enables a specified special effect played when the entity triggers the buff. We can use the resource selection button to select the desired effect in the assets view, or we can specify the effect by dragging and dropping it. If you only want the entity that triggers the buff to see the effect instead of synchronizing it to all other entities, you can choose to check visible to self only. You can also adjust the appearance of the effect with the special effect position, special effect launch angle, and effect size. Then there is the appearance function. The appearance function allows the entity that triggers the buff to change the appearance of its character. Click the Add button on the right to add an appearance setting item. We can adjust a certain appearance of the character by setting appearance group name, and appearance mutual exclusion group. For example, we make the player to change his helmet when the buff is triggered. If you want to adjust the entity's multiple appearance styles when triggering the buff, you can then click the Add button multiple times to add multiple appearance settings. If you want to delete an appearance setting item, you can click the menu button on the right and operate in the small pop-up window. Finally, the Enable Transparency function. After checking this function, the entity will become translucent when the buff is triggered. In game design, the music is an indispensable content. So, in the editor, how to add a background music to the game. Let's implement this function with a buff. First, we import a sound effect resource in MP3 format. Then create a new buff in the buff component. Click its performance property, and then click the audio selection button to enter the assets view, and select the imported sound effect resource. Then adjust the volume of the sound effect. Since the game background music is played in a loop, we need to check the loop property. Now as long as we add this buff to the player entity, when the entity enters the game, the function of playing background music will be realized. Next, we write the event logic for the player entities entering the game and add the buff. Open the Edit Events interface for the player entity. Click the New button to create a new trigger. We choose when the entity enters the game. Drag out the action node list from the execution interface, and select Add Buff to Entity from the entity list. For the entity parameter, select the entity that enters the game from the current event parameters list. For the buff parameter, select the buff you have just created. Since the game background music is played in a loop, we do not need to limit the duration of the buff. After we finish editing the event logic, go back to the editor, click the menu button next to the Run. Select 2 players and run the game. Once we enter the game, we find that the background music of the game overlaps. Even if we turn off the music for one of the players, the background music of the other player is still overlapping. This is because we add a buff that plays music to each player who enters the game, but we didn't set the music to be audible only to each player himself. Which means that every player is equivalent to a music player, playing the same music simultaneously. So, how do we fix this? It's actually pretty simple. As long as we check audible to self only in the performance property of buff, then players will only hear the background music played by the buffs to themselves. That's all for this video. We hope it can help you on your way to a great creator. If you want to know more about the editor, you can comment below the video or post on the official forum. See you in the next video.